It's a spin-off of the HBO program produced by HBO. At the very least, or most, it's an adaptation. Or if you like, it's a Shakespeare play, and the question of historical perspective becomes a major factor. In any case, nothing is confirmed. I'm talking, of course, about Game of Thrones, The Mad King, the new Song of Ice and Fire stage play now in previews at the Royal Shakespeare Company Theatre at Stratford-upon-Avon, lately producing a steady stream of spoilers. We won't be discussing any spoilers, at least not for a good while, and I'll let you know before we do. Spoilers, lore, secrets, and mysteries revealed. No doubt some of them direct from the mind of George R.R. Martin himself, the author of one of the most important works of literature of our time, from which the new play by Duncan Macmillan is adapted. What sounds like a fantastic theatrical experience, complete with puppets and jousting and puppets jousting. The question for those of us consumed by the puzzles of this yet unfinished fantasy series, its clockwork mysteries, its veils of perspective, is what to make of these revelations that come for now in the form of posts, but which some of us might see someday on the stage and will at some point away down the road be published in a readable form. The posts I'll be referring to are from GOT, the Mad King updates at GOT_onstage on Twitter or whatever. Link up top and below. Mine may turn out to be a hard case to make in any definitively convincing sense. It may run contrary to how many will interpret all of this new information. The first new narrative details about A Song of Ice and Fire since the end of Game of Thrones, the HBO television adaptation, henceforth the show, beloved by millions. It boils down to that in a way. The case I'll try to make from several angles is that if what we're interested in is what's in the author's head, what he plans, what already exists, in what he's already written of the as-yet unpublished continuation of the series, we should treat the details coming out of these previews and any other more granular details which emerge in future with the same skepticism we should have for everything that happens in the show. To make this case, we'll talk about the nature of adaptation, the nature of the Game of Thrones adaptation, and, as a treat, the nature of Shakespeare's historical adaptations. I didn't watch the show when it was at its height as a global phenomenon. I started binging it the week it ended. I recall thinking in the very beginning that if even this kind of silly and uneven but very entertaining TV show is this sophisticated in its political drama, its human motivations, the books must really be fantastic. Somehow by the time I finished streaming Game of Thrones, I had forgotten about my plans to read the series. I didn't pick up a Game of Thrones until Thanksgiving weekend of 2022. It changed my life. I became obsessed with understanding what was going on in the story, what the author was planning, foreshadowing, and hiding behind the veils of so many perspectives. I became enthralled with my own interpretations and finding that they existed nowhere online over a decade and 500 million posts since the last book, with the idea of sharing them. And I've slowly begun to do so, though there's much more to come. Watch the Battle of Wind videos, the characters and castles by Carl F. Nelson, and the original cut paper banners by Erin are from those. But this project was born in a theoretical milieu where it's pretty easy to just ignore the show altogether. No doubt the wide swath of people interested in discussing and analyzing these novels have varying interpretations as to the relationship of the books to the show. My interpretation, or my method of analysis, is likely far to one side of that spectrum. But there was already enough terrain to stand on in this regard that I don't even feel the need to bring it up in my videos. I don't bring up the show at all in general. I only even refute it offhand, indirectly. Yes, because Martin himself has said the show is the show and the books are the books. And yes, because so many things in the show so clearly diverge from what has already been published in novel form. But also, I think, because the show sucked. It was bad. Certainly the ending seasons seem to be widely loathed. So the territory for the position that nothing that happens in the show needs to happen at all, or in a remotely similar fashion in the novels, was already staked out long before I put foot to ground. But even though I wasn't there, I'm asking you to either remember or imagine what it must have been like to travel the Theoryverse when the show was on the air. How many little details and revelations were, at least for some time, at least by many viewers, many interlocutors in the Ice and Fire theorizing world, taken as indications of the direction of the books, as clues to the truth of what we care about, what I care about, what is really happening in the novels, what's really in the author's mind. But it's not. Oh, the show is certainly a source of clues. You might find inspiration there that could lead you to guessing what the old wizard is up to, and people have done so. But mostly I think it leads us all astray. Because I've focused significantly on Stannis, his plans, and his future, people in my comments are always asking me about the burning of Shireen. It's one of these things that Martin has purportedly said will actually happen. And I don't doubt that it will. I have a theory for that, which I really like, and we'll get to in a Battle of Wind video eventually. But it's so far flung from what happens in the show that many people don't seem to be able to make the leap. Even if they say they can entertain that it will happen differently, their imagination is often constrained to many of the circumstances of the show. I'm telling you the obvious simple truth here. The adaptation is simply not the book. This new play, like the show, is an adaptation. Like the show, it no doubt contains many things which will bear strong resemblance to what the author has in mind for the books. But like the show, it's basically impossible to know what's what, or how any of it might play out in the novels. And I'm comfortable arguing that even very specific scenes and details, even very specific apparent answers to long open mysteries which might really feel like they would not exist except to stand as revelations of the truth, can be and likely are, like the show, a heavily divergent adaptation. Maybe utterly contradictory, conscious acts of preservation of the mysteries. It's mentioned in most of the press material and in the analysis I've seen so far that Martin was heavily personally involved with the production and indeed the script. Do I need to remind us all that he was even more involved in the show? He wrote episodes of the show. He wrote episodes of the show even after the show diverged from the books in those small ways he's referred to as butterflies for their counterintuitively chaotic tendency to cause problems down the road in ways unforeseen or unheeded by his collaborators. He personally wrote and took credit for scripts in which he was writing, perhaps at that time, an arguably still only subtly different version of his own story. But I would say that because of the clockwork nature of the tale, the intricacy of its planning, foreshadowing, and perspective, the show diverges in pretty huge ways from minute one, ways the author was never not aware of. But he's a co-creator and producer of the show. He's in a business venture with the showrunners and the home box office, and he's a committed artist and showman himself. He understands the nature of adaptation and is interested in making the best television he can. Maybe it's easy to have some preciousness about the sanctity of the story to the author, to imagine that he would never participate in or write anything that seriously diverges from his own tale. I don't know what to tell you. You'd be wrong to think that. I'm not saying he likes it. In at least 2 instances, the shows seem to have diverged so much, being so dismissive of his vision that he's thrown up his hands. But that's a matter of degree and of futility. If you want to understand the process of adaptation with the author involved, understand that even ideas that come from the author need not actually reflect his own concept of the published story. He was making the show. I promise you along the way, he himself offered ideas which, because they originated in the context of a story that had already diverged from his, were not ideas which he would ever incorporate into his novels, but rather alternate ideas meant to serve the story being told on screen. I'm not even talking about the stuff that has been reported as having come from George. I'm saying there would have been lots of discussions in which he's offering ideas for and writing the story that the show was becoming, even as it was different from his own. So when I hear that Martin himself was enthusiastically involved with the scripting of the play, or even if Duncan Macmillan, the playwright, had him on speed dial and they talked every day, it doesn't change for me that this is an adaptation. In fact, the most likely scenario is that the playwright and other stakeholders talked to Martin at length, got lots of his ideas, and then Macmillan went off for a long period, a year or more, and wrote the play. Then no doubt Martin had many thoughts on that first draft, and some of his ideas were probably taken into consideration and reworked into the material. Oh, at some point in there, after getting the job but before starting the script, Macmillan probably read A Song of Ice and Fire for the first time. Just a guess, but my point is that this is how things get made. It's not a precious process. It just isn't. Putting on an elaborate stage play filled with a cast of your own epic heroes is fun and cool, and I would assume Martin himself is personally invested in making these adaptations as good as he can within the constraints of this reality. So what exactly is that reality in this case? There are a few possibilities, but one of them, like I said at the top, is that this whole thing might be better understood by those of us who care as an adaptation of the show, as another spin-off of the HBO program Game of Thrones, like House of the Dragon, or at least as sometimes closer to that than it is to the books. It's likely not exactly this simple, but go with me for a moment. And don't misunderstand me, I wouldn't rest my case on this next part of the argument, but it bears saying. The play is called Game of Thrones, The Mad King. You may recall that Game of Thrones is the title of the show, not the book or the series. The Royal Shakespeare Company's own material confirms that the play is co-produced by Warner Brothers Theatre Ventures on behalf of HBO. Does this mean anything? I can concede there is a scenario in which it could mean nothing for our purposes. Because of their ownership of presumably wide-ranging rights to adaptations of A Song of Ice and Fire, including theatrical rights, back to the original deal done with Martin and Benioff and Weiss, HBO would have to be involved legally and financially at least in any stage production, no matter who thought up the idea and no matter the approach taken to the material. And as for the title, we could argue that Game of Thrones is simply the name of the highly marketable global brand and is being used for obvious reasons, and all of this would be absolutely true. But it could also be true that, in large part anyway, this adaptation hews deliberately in key moments to the story of the show. Firstly, for the obvious reasons. The show is hugely popular and this play is being produced by HBO. It really is not at all inconceivable that they would put on this play and hew to the show's story rather than the books wherever there was a conflict, so as not to confuse their own audience for the story they are currently still producing multiple shows around. They really could be thinking of this as a companion piece to the HBO shows. If the instinct is to wonder why this isn't made more clear or why this is even a question, first of all, I would point back to the title, but also to all the press material and interviews with Martin and Macmillan et al., who keep referring to the work studiously, deliberately, I think, as being adapted from both.
Characters that you will know and love if you know the books and the series.
They say it both ways in the same sentence. Look, I don't like reading the tea leaves of public statements, which is why I don't use them to back up my actual theories. I tend only to refute the author's statements. So all I'm saying here is that what's been said is consciously broad and deliberately ambiguous. If this feels too cagey, it's not really. It only seems that way from our oddball perspective. Most people who go to see this play won't care about these nuances, and the press material and interviews are not directed at us, the obsessive theorists. The purpose is marketing the play to a wide audience. So, while no strong determination is warranted here, it remains very possible that the choices made were to lean into the show's story where it differs. Here come the spoilers. The next reason to believe this play is working from the show's story is that several of the leaked spoilers point towards scenes which would constitute major revelations to readers of the books in a world where the show didn't exist. Some scenes, the most revealing to my mind, seem to close the loop on long-open mysteries in a way very similar to the television show. I'll be talking about each of them in the near future, at least on Patreon, maybe on YouTube. But for now, take for example Ned's fight with the Kingsguard at the Tower of Joy and the death of Arthur Dane. According to reports, and also to helpful comments reminding me how the show played out because I don't remember, they are very similar. We could take this as evidence that the show was correct. And I'll be honest, although it's not an area I've yet delved deeply into, I'm pretty sympathetic to readings of deeper mystery in general, but of the survival of the Kingsguard more specifically. Actually, I had hoped to get off a few videos before the play dropped, not of predictions for the play per se, but hedges against anything being revealed in the play that would spoil my own theories. I didn't think the play would be so expansive, so epic in scope, covering from Harrenhal through Robert's Rebellion and multiple perspectives at the Tower of Joy. I was worried we might learn a few little details at Harrenhal which, upon deep examination, might provide some clues to theories I believe but had not yet done a video on. One such theory, not my own, but one on which I have things to say and wrote a whole script about last week, is that Oswell Went is alive, living as Oswell Kettleblack, and his 3 idiot bastard sons are the squire bullies who pick on Howland Reed in Mira's hiking story from A Storm of Swords. There are things to say about how I think it's funny that this kind of theory is fashionably disregarded, and why I disagree, and details like how I guess they got their assumed name and how they fit into the larger narrative I'm talking about in the Battle of Wind videos. So if you want to think of my reaction to the play spoilers as coping with loss, go right ahead. In the play, it seems Gerald Hightower, Arthur Dane, and Oswell Wendt all die at the hands of Ned and his posse, much as in the show. The point is, in some places, the spoilers indicate that the play takes the fairly straightforward, nothing to see here approach that the show often did. So we can take that either as an indication of the faithfulness of the show to the books, or simply of the play to the show. So what would Martin's perspective in all this be? Well, if HBO made it clear that the play would have to more or less follow the show where such scenes overlapped, I think he'd want to do his best to help that process and offer ideas for the story which fit that template. Yes, even giving up some new information which is part of his story for the books, but in a manner which fits the brief. In this scenario, the scenes which play out largely as they do in the show, within the margin of error of a second adaptation in another medium, do so because that was the brief. The rest, the really new stuff, well, that's more complicated. The question is, how would Martin choose to introduce new revelatory material, whether in the HBO spin-off scenario or otherwise? One question that is likely to come up in these discussions here is whether you think the books will be finished. There's a lot of doom out there, and so I can imagine many readers and observers interpreting this play as an opportunity to tell more, reveal more of the author's own story because it will never come in any other way. I've long thought about making a whole video on this subject, but in brief, I find the idea that The Winds of Winter will never be published to be absurd. Unless Martin is lying and has actually written nothing or very, very little, the well over 1,000 pages of manuscript he says he's written is well more than enough to publish the next installment. So in any circumstance, we will be getting that book. The rest is just details. The book is coming out. Whatever quibbles people have with this probably misunderstand publishing and the world in general. In fact, I think it's pretty likely that the series will be completed. By the author, I can't believe I have to say that. But my reasons are complex and really would require a whole discussion, not to just sound like cope. Much like my theories on Stannis and Mance and Littlefinger sound like nonsense when reduced to a few sentences. They're complicated, they take some explaining. So I see this epic theatrical production in the context of the author continuing toward and possibly even finishing his magnum opus. I take him at his word that he's still very passionate about doing that, and I understand that it's a mammoth task, often underappreciated in its literary scope. So is there a scenario I can imagine wherein he's passionate about one of the installments in that great magnum opus of modernist literary fantasy being not one of his own books, but someone else's stage play? Barely. Not really. Maybe a much more circumspect story of just the tourney itself or some other discrete event. Maybe if he wrote it himself, if he had always wanted to also be a playwright and could see such a play as part of his own literary corpus. But as is, no. I think he would see it as yet another adaptation, like the show, one he's probably actually powerless to stop even if he wanted to. Not that he would. Most likely he's invested in making the best thing he can, making it as close as he can to his vision, even if that means sometimes hewing to the story of the show. And here's the real point. This constraint, whether dictated by HBO or self-imposed, would be nothing but a gift for Martin. Here he is working on his life's masterpiece, so many ideas, so many stories, so many lives he's been molding into a narrative he wants nothing more than to take the reader through in the form of literature, prose, his written word. That's his craft. But he made a deal with the Hollywood devil long ago, and so his words now get adapted endlessly into something else. He continues to try to make the most of this double-edged sword. On some level, when the show began to fully disengage with his writing and his plans, although he felt compelled to divulge those plans to his collaborators, he must have felt some relief that they were going to mostly ignore it and do their own thing with his ideas only peppered in. It preserves a lot of the mystery, the thrill of discovery, the power of the author to take us through the story in his own words and in his own way. Mind you, I don't even doubt that Martin himself could be the source of the idea of doing the play about the tourney at Harrenhal, though I would bet someone approached him about doing a play in the first place. But I can also easily imagine that by simply letting the choices of the show dictate the story, he can help create what sounds like a fantastic theatrical experience, complete with puppets and jousting and puppets jousting, all while withholding the revelations of many mysteries he would naturally prefer to save for the real work, his life's work, the novels. Let's take another example from the revelations. Elia, Rhaegar's wife, is apparently an active participant, even instigator in the plot to raise her husband to the throne. Imagine the three possible sources of this notion: the playwright, the author for the play, and the author from the books, or his prior conception of them. The first option, that this is an invention of the playwright, seems fairly likely. It seems, from the spoilers, that the extramarital relationship between Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark is a central structuring element of the play. They meet at Harrenhal, it follows both of them through their time together and to each of their deaths, after which Ned and Robert's stories seem to be shortly concluded. Given this, it would be a very natural instinct on the part of the playwright to make a significant character out of Elia, Rhaegar's wife. It would follow as well that the playwright would seek to give her something to do, to give her a purpose and the agency to effect that purpose. So it would be pretty natural for this to have arrived out of the structural choices made about the play. Another option is Martin came up with this idea for the same reasons. Plausible. I don't doubt that this is the case for some choices. The third option, which I'd rate as only slightly less likely than the first, is that this is always something that Martin had in mind for this period in the story and the character of Elia. One thing that came up in multiple of my scripts talking about possible theory spoilers for the play was Rhaegar's own ambivalence toward the plot to overthrow his father. I think I've talked about this previously on the Patreon, but I have long suspected that Rhaegar was probably being recruited more than he was instigating, and also that the choice to crown Lyanna at the tourney was a choice in part to opt out of that plan. Another thing that comes up in my thinking in those scripts is kind of obvious, but I have always thought we are meant to understand that lots of people in the realm were feeling that something needed to be done for stability going forward. This is what I mean when in the Battle of Wind series I say that while Stannis was against Robert declaring himself king, politically, strategically, and morally, he was probably among the many who would have supported Rhaegar ascending early, his father taking an early abdication. It's an opinion Robert might well hold against Stannis. So it makes all the sense in the world that Elia would be a political player and have a point of view on what to do about the Mad King. My point is that, just like the show, any new element could be part of Martin's thinking and part of how the story will proceed in print. But good luck divining what's what. Like the show, the best you can do is take the new information as clues, as inspiration for analysis and guessing what's really in the author's head. But I would bet a lot of it won't be. I'll say it. I still think Oswell Went is alive. Hopefully soon I'll share my reasons. Mind you, it seems likely that the play doesn't follow the show religiously either. This would be impossible for any adaptation. It's the nature of adaptation and a reality both Martin and Macmillan would have been aware of going in and would have discussed how to confront it. I'm just saying I think they probably went that way often for a complicated host of reasons. It's what HBO might have wanted, and it would have been easier and safer for Martin to encourage it to proceed that way or not protest. Even the differences with the show are interesting. Apparently, the birth of Lyanna's child goes much the same as in the show, but it's also been noted that unlike the show, she doesn't name him Aegon. But she doesn't name him at all. So at first pass, it does seem that, in this case at least, Martin is pulling a punch, choosing not to reveal what Rhaegar and or Lyanna named Jon, yet apparently giving so much else away. But also consider this. If Martin and Macmillan are being a little cute with what continuity they are following, if they have discussed and considered this question, and why wouldn't they, and decided to leave it a little ambiguous and let it at least seem to stand as its own thing when examined with the 1,000 microscopes they know it will be subjected to, what else could they do? If they name him Aegon, as in the show, it's a single detail that would certainly seem to contradict the books in the same way as the show. I mean, you could argue that Rhaegar might name both of his sons Aegon, I guess, but setting that aside, the real point is that in the show, the character of Aegon, young Griff, is more or less erased and some of his story combined with that of Jon Snow. It's one of the biggest differences between the two series, as will no doubt become even clearer when The Winds of Winter drops, or when parts 5 and 6 of the Battle of Wind series drop on this channel. So they don't name him Aegon, but neither do they name him anything else, not Jon nor Viserys or some other Targaryen name. It's just left ambiguous. The play, if the interpretations are correct, seems to suggest that both Dany and Jon are conceived and born within its runtime, yet they choose to leave murky their exact identities. Interestingly, Elia gives birth to her second child at Harrenhal. I've not seen anyone mention whether this child was specifically named, but if not, I would find that very sneaky and very telling. On the subject of the Aegon VI plot being excised from the show, I've also seen it noted that Jon Connington apparently makes no appearance. Rhaegar's lovelorn friend seems to have been left out of the gay cabal at the center of the plot to force the abdication of Aerys II. Heartbreaking or telling? You decide. In any case, there is no question that the play doesn't follow exactly the story of the show. Such a thing would be impossible. It's a different adaptation in a different medium with its own imperatives. But let's look at it another way. Much is made in the promotional interviews of this being put on by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and that its structure, scope, and style is inspired by Shakespeare himself, and specifically his historical plays. Now recall with me that A Song of Ice and Fire is a modernist work absolutely obsessed with perspective. It uses its many narrative perspectives not only to show us different points of view to create and inhabit many different characters, but also to limit the release of information to the reader. We know only what the characters know, and not even all of that, in part because we bounce around so much. The complex tale never devolves into idiot plot, in part because the perspectives are so far-flung and embedded in their own stories and motives that they rarely have any opportunity to figure anything out together. The work's adherence to its perspectives is utterly rigorous. So elemental to the whole project is this rigorous adherence to perspective that books like Fire and Blood and The World of Ice and Fire must have their own perspective as well. In order to tell the histories of Westeros and the wide world, of the Targaryen dynasty, Martin had to invent perspectives from which to tell them. Fire and Blood is written, I gather, I've never read it, it feels too much like cheating. I'll get to it someday. It's written as a history, written by a maester, one who seems to be writing or at least completing that volume in the Baratheon period. That is, the period where political power is dominated by the people who overthrew the dynasty the history is about. Now think about Shakespeare's War of the Roses cycle, oft cited by Martin himself not only as inspirations for this new play, but also for the novels themselves. Shakespeare's history plays are hardly perfect reflections of the actual past. They are entertaining pastiche written and performed in a time when England was ruled by the people who overthrew the warring Plantagenets. The War of the Roses plays depict the Lancasters and Yorks as fighting back and forth and causing chaos. That's probably true, but none of them is more famously done dirty than Richard III. Now, he may have killed those nephews of his, and when they dug him up in a car park a decade ago, it did seem to confirm that he had some spinal deformity. But Shakespeare makes him out to be the most conniving, cynical, scheming, power-hungry freak ever to walk England's green and pleasant land. It's no coincidence that it was Richard III who was overthrown by Henry Tudor, who would be crowned Henry VII, father of Henry VIII, grandfather of Elizabeth I, whose reign saw the boom in English theater that produced William Shakespeare. I'm saying this, while Martin may or may not see fit to hint on his blog someday that the play is really more of a spin-off of the show than it is the books, I won't hold my breath. But I would not be at all surprised if he waxes at some point on the dubious historicity of Shakespeare's plays and the need to take them with a grain of salt. That's what I'll be doing as I continue to put out more of the Battle of Winds series, which doesn't seem that related to any of these revelations, except in that it supposes there is some mystery to this story and that all is never as it seems. Anyway, you know what the buttons do. I'm Greg, aka Moonman, and you are probably not buying any of this.